Welcome, everyone, to the very first session in our virtual Earth Day. We're so pleased that you were able to make it, and we are very excited to kick off the festival with a very esteemed individual, Dr. Peter Raven, President Emeritus of Missouri Botanical Garden. I should also mention my role. I am the the executive director of Earth Day 365, the organization that puts on the virtual Earth Day Festival and the live Earth Day Festival in the park usually. And so we were very, very pleased when Dr. Raven agreed to come and help us kick off this new endeavor that we have into the virtual realm. So thank you again, Peter, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank you, Dr. Jess Watson, for getting together the group at Earth Day 365 and organizing this virtual Earth Day festival. It is a real feat to have been able to do that during the COVID-19 epidemic, and wonderful that the tradition, which has been so important for the last 50 years, is going on. And I'll begin by saying that anybody who lived through the 60s will remember them as a tumultuous, very confusing time with social pressures from all directions coming together in such a way as to change the world forever. On the day of the first Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970, 1 out of 10 Americans, about 20 million people, came out to one of the Earth Day events somewhere around the country. The largest ones were in Washington and New York, but they were all over the place. And what is really significant about that Earth Day is that it gave rise to the most critically important and well-considered set of environmental laws and regulations that have been created yet to preserve public health and the environment. To give you an idea of the changes that have happened over the past 50 years, at the time of the first Earth Day, the global population was 3.6 billion people, and today it's 7.8 billion people, more than double. In the US, there were about 200 million people then, and there are about 330 million people now. In 1970 in the world, according to Global Footprint Network, we were consuming about 70% of what the world produces on a sustainable basis, potentially sustainable productivity. And now we're consuming about 175% of what the world produces, which means that after about July 30th last year, we had already consumed all of the sustainable productivity that was available. At the same time, we can note that if everybody in the world lived at the level of consumption that we do in the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, it would require 5 copies of this planet to support us all. In other words, we're way beyond what can be supported at the present time. Poor nations are often sinking farther into poverty. Rich ones are becoming richer, and somehow we don't care enough to try to do much about it. We need to think about a slogan like "Make America Great Again" means in a context like that, when it can only mean draining resources vigorously away from the whole rest of the world. In 1970, scientists used to think there were about 3 million kinds of organisms in the world, and now we think there are about 20 million. Perhaps half of that 20 million are in danger of extinction during the remainder of this century. Today, indoor and outdoor air pollution contributes to the untimely death of about 8 million people annually and is one of the largest killers in the world. More than a quarter of the world's people, about 2.1 million of us, lack access to clean drinking water, and perhaps half of us in the world lack adequate nutritious food, and about 890 million of us are on the edge of starvation. Climate change was first recognized as likely in about in the 1890s, and by 1970, Those people who are really tuned in knew that it was going on, but on the other hand, little was being done about it. By now, 50 years later, we recorded an increase of 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit in global warm temperatures, with as much as another 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit possible over the next 30 years, an environmental catastrophe, an inevitable conclusion. Given the current global situation, a visitor from another planet would simply not be able to believe that in America we have a government that is systematically destroying the sound environmental laws that have served us for half a century, when the situation is so much more serious now and requires them so very badly. We are, by doing so, increasing air and water pollution, rapidly driving the species that collectively support all life on Earth to extinction, and contributing to global warming at a rate that will unabated destroy huge sections of the world's agriculture and make many areas of the globe essentially uninhabitable. On this Earth Day occasion, we need to resolve to make changes comparable to those brought about by public outcry in the 1960s, outrage, I should say, and try to set the Earth back on a path in which the welfare of our children and grandchildren can again begin to take some precedence over the production of wealth that some of us can accumulate over the very short run. Let's resolve on this occasion to fight together for a sustainable Earth. After all, we really only have one of them. Now, what were some of the particular developments and events that led to the organization of the first Earth Day? Ecology, we may not realize today so much, is a relatively young science, and there was very little development in ecology before World War II. Most of the information that we have now about the way organisms interact with one another and form ecosystems having been developed since the end of the war, from the 1940s on to the present. Ecosystems are really understood now in a way that they were not understood before the war, and we are gaining, as we gain increasing information about them, we learn how important they are for controlling the air that we breathe, its quality, its composition, the clarity and purity of the water we drink, the prevention of erosion, the absorptions of pollution, and the conservation of the species that inhabit those ecosystems, including our own species. Those of us who lived in the late 1940s and 50s realized that after World War II, the generation that had gone through the Great Depression in the 1930s and the war was not very worried about the environment. In fact, was really ready for better times. In that atmosphere, many people didn't worry much about pitching their garbage out along roadsides, polluting streams and lakes, or much else that might slow down their perceived enjoyment of life. At the same time, there were warnings that many of these activities might not be supportable over the long run. Systemic pesticides like DDT, which was developed during World War II, began to be used widely, and the composition of the atmosphere changed rapidly as they were used. A real warning signal was 1962, Rachel Carson's famous book, Silent Spring, which pointed out that DDT, by being concentrated in the insects and other animals that were consumed, that DDT was killing off the bald eagle, our national icon, and many other kinds of birds and animals, and seriously disturbing the world ecosystem. That in itself set forward an era of environmentalism as people began to fight about whether DDT ought to be banned and what ought to be done about it. But at the same time, other parts of the environment, like waters, were becoming increasingly polluted. Simultaneously, in the mid-1960s, America's effort to maintain what was essentially a colonial outlook in Vietnam, controlled by people from the outside, by waging a ground war there, became the subject of a lot of demonstrations. And as they grew in importance, people began to become much more active, and demonstrations and teach-ins on university campuses and generally, both in the United States and abroad, bolstered the feeling that was growing at the time that the establishment might simply not care enough. In that increasingly rebellious atmosphere in the late 60s, Wisconsin's Senator Gaylord Nelson became a leader of discontent. He was elected at middle age to the U.S. Senate in 1962 and immediately became an important spokesperson for civil rights, civil liberties, the preservation of the environment, and from the beginning, an outspoken critic of the Vietnam War. Recognizing the power of the student-led teach-ins about the war that were going on in the late 1960s, Nelson conceived the idea of a similar activity on the environment, which would be called Earth Day. He selected April 22nd, 1970 for the first of these, and then enlisted the help of a 26-year-old Harvard graduate student named Dennis Hayes, who proved to be a lifetime champion, not only of Earth Day, but of the environment, with extraordinary skills at coordinating and working on these problems. At the same time, in the 1960s, the unjust practice of racial segregation was being unwound further by right-minded people like Nelson, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 a real landmark in the process. It's sad to reflect today that we still have a long way to go to ensure equal rights for all of our citizens in the United States, much less social justice around the world. In 1968, both the Reverend Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were assassinated, and the riots at the Democratic Convention in Chicago were among the events that stirred up the public passion still further and helped to bolster the national desire to do something about it. In 1969, a chemical plant releasing chemicals into the Cuyahoga River near Cleveland so polluted the river that it caught on fire, and that became a kind of an icon of all the problems that were going on. In the same year, 1969, the population bomb published by Paul and Ann Ehrlich drew serious attention to population as a global problem of deep concern, simply because the growth could not go on forever. And they echoed a book by Fairfield Osborne, Our Plundered Planet, from the 1940s in doing so. Now, as I said earlier, on the first Earth Day in 1970, some 20 million Americans turned out for the teach-ins, and that was 1 out of every 10 people in the United States. The magnitude of the event not only surprised the organizers, Nelson and Hayes, but impressed everyone. A few months after the first Earth Day, Congress passed the Clean Air Act of 1970. Over the next 20 years, that law cost $523 billion, but the Environmental Protection Agency estimated that during the same period, it produced $22 trillion in benefits for public health and the economy, preventing billions of tons of costly materials from being lost up the smokestack and giving rise to toxic pollutants in the air later. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, was actually established by President Nixon only 8 months after the first Earth Summit in December 1970 to protect human health and safeguard the natural environment, air, water, and land. In 1972, Congress passed the Clean Water Act, and in 1973, the Endangered Species Act. As this was all carried out under President Nixon, we may seriously wonder and remark how insane it is to regard the protection of the environment and the health of the people in the United States as a political issue, and how very critically important it is for us to get away from that viewpoint. Those laws have not only enhanced the health and safety of Americans ever since they become models of environmental action worldwide and become framework for subsequent activities here. For example, the Clean Air Amendments of 1990 targeting acid rain emissions from coal burning plants, mainly here in the Midwest, turned out to cost much less than expected, although as usual, industry made a great squawk in the beginning about how intolerable they'd be and how they would cause everything to crash. But they cost much less than expected, between 500 million and 2 billion a year, and turned out to have benefits of between 59 and 116 billion per year, and to have important health benefits nationwide. The EPA estimates currently that these reductions in air pollution have led to 2.4 million fewer cases of aggravated asthma, 200,000 fewer heart attacks, 5.4 million fewer lost school days, 17 million fewer lost work days, and 237 fewer premature deaths, not collectively, but each year since those amendments were first passed. Can we really believe that an attempt is being now made to dismantle them, and to what effect? Benefits have exceeded costs by a ratio of 30 to 1, adding up to a total economic gain through 2020 of $2 trillion. And examples of that sort could be multiplied many times over. Earth Day 1970 was strongly focused on the United States. It was people worrying about how we were poisoning ourselves and wrecking the environment here. But very soon, it became obvious that these problems were global in nature. The United Nations, recognizing the importance of our common environment, convened a conference on the human environment in Stockholm in May 1972, 2 years after our Earth Day. The exceedingly capable UN civil servant, Maurice Strong, a Canadian, basically revised the subject matter of that conference as it went along, from one focused on the mutual pollution of the Baltic Seas to one focused on global environmental problems, and the world has never felt the same since to those who spend time thinking about it. On the 20th anniversary of Earth Day in 1990, there were participants in 140 countries, and in 2000, hundreds of millions of people in 184 countries focused on clean energy. So where are we today? Our response to climate change has been far too limited, and collectively we seem unable to grasp the enormous economic damage for which we're setting ourselves up in the coming decades. We seem able to set and argue about what we call safe limits, but then unable, through our agreements, to take and enforce the steps would allow them to be met. There is very little enthusiasm really for conserving species throughout the world, although their loss will be permanent and pose huge problems in the future. Posing rollbacks in these things is really a kind of madness, and one can only make the world less healthy and less habitable until we somehow come back to our senses. Everyone except those immediately enriched will soon come to regret that 95 environmental regulations rolled back or in the process of being rolled back in the current administration. In fact, the longer we continue to pretend in America that we're different from the rest of the world, the less competitive our economy will be. An obvious relationship that seems not to be taken seriously by many current decision makers at the national level. Everything apparently is needed for, as a result of our selfishness and for our short-term gratification. While we engage in childish deregulation justified by word games, companies and their investors have come increasingly to realize that in a set of constant rules, they can actually make economies and gain profits that would otherwise be impossible. Continuous innovation in a steady environment aiming to produce stability is exactly the environment within which businesses can make gains. And that's why, of course, so many businesses have opposed the counterproductive rollbacks that we talk about at the present time. So to summarize, as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, we're living in an overcrowded world filled with challenges to our future well-being. Pollution, climate change, and biodiversity loss are among the most important issues with which we must come to grips. As major religions have noted, it is the poor who must bear the burden that we cause by ignoring them and ignoring these regulations and not worrying about a clean earth. And any moral problem would regard it as a sin or a crime or a moral wrong to simply go on enriching ourselves while the poor suffer. What can we do about all of this? Well, first, we have to recognize the fact that we live on one planet. And we can do that by being sure we teach ourselves and our children about the ways the world functions as a whole and familiarizing them to the extent possible with the different parts of the world. At the same time, any actions we take to reduce our own consumption in a rich country like the United States, from avoiding plastic products which have such great environmental harm associated with them, to consuming mostly locally grown food by considering largely vegetarian diets, will be good. Globally, we need to cooperate closely to solve problems like climate change and biodiversity loss. Childishly pulling out of agreements instead of helping to improve them and make them more effective is simply an end strategy that does not work for anyone's benefit. The empowerment of women and children is a very important cause worldwide, with about 1 billion women in the world basically disenfranchised and having therefore no ability to contribute to our further dealing effectively with these environmental problems or with any other problems. Even in the United States and other advanced countries where we're proud of the fact that we've given women the vote a century ago and so forth, still need to do very much work to make sure that they and all racial minorities are treated as equal members of our society in every respect and enabled to contribute whatever they can intellectually or in any other way to our common future. Lifelong learning about the environment and teaching other people is one very important thing that we can do, and being sure that the environment is treated fully and currently at all levels of education from grammar school through graduate school is one of the very important things we could do about it. If we can bring that about, and if we can use the knowledge that we get as the situation develops further, we will make the world a better place. We need to vote into office those who know the world should have a future in place of greedy short-term thinkers who end up working actively to destroy that future. Anyone who considers that care for the environment should be a partisan issue is a fool and should be treated as such. President Nixon, after all, was not a liberal Democrat. The state of the world and the health of its people cannot continue to be treated in that way. Business as usual is no longer good enough, and we should use the inspiration of Earth Day and all it represents to reaffirm our commitment to action. Now, thank you very much for listening to me. This is the kickoff for a 9-day virtual festival, and please explore the rest of the festival while you're tuned in on this channel. The next speaker will be Gina Jane on One St. Louis, Regional Sustainability Through Collaboration, and she will take over at 11:30 a.m. Thank you very much indeed for listening, and I urge you to become as active as the people were who attended the first Earth Day 50 years ago.